Thank you for tuning in to High Green, the official podcast of the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society. High Green is funded by your membership in the society, and any opinions expressed throughout the show are solely those of the owner. As always, if you'd like to learn more about our organization or join us, you can find our website, www.bmrrhs.org.
Perhaps this story hasn't been told in B&M circles, but it's a B&M story and it's a good one.
Oh my God, he says, I don't think I ever saw a train down here before. He was amused.
I still have that wanderlust. I still want to go back railroading.
As we head into the holiday season, be sure to check out our online store for all kinds of great Boston and Maine themed gifts. You can find things like our 16-ounce glasses emblazoned with the Minuteman logo, our discs including all editions of our magazine, the B&M Bulletin, up to 2020. We also have winter jackets, sweatshirts, hoodies, winter hats, baseball hats, t-shirts, and all kinds of great books and reading material, including our latest publication, Steam Trains of Yesteryear, the Monadnock Steam Town in Northern Story, which chronicles one of the earliest tourist railroad operations on Boston and Maine trackage. You can head right on over to our online store to find all of these and many more things for the Boston and Maine fan in your life. Or maybe even a little holiday gift for yourself. And from all of us here at the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society, we'd like to wish you a happy, safe, and healthy holiday season. Thank you so much for your support. So hello and welcome to the latest edition of High Green, the official podcast from the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society. We're here tonight in the home of Jesse Mazzie, who we are going to be talking to a little bit about his connection to the Boston and Maine Railroad through his life. Jesse grew up in Danvers, Massachusetts, so he grew up along the former Boston and Maine Newburyport Branch and in close proximity to the Danvers Branch and the Lawrence Branch. Jesse grew up after the Boston and Maine was absorbed into Guilford. So his memories of the Boston and Maine is more of the period after the B&M ceased to exist as an independent organization. But he has some memories of B&M operations on former B&M lines. He also has worked on former B&M lines. And he's also worked with the Cotton Valley Rail Trail Club in enthusiast operations on former B&M lines. So he has quite a connection to the Boston and Maine Railroad. So Jesse, welcome to High Green.
Thank you, Rick, for having me on your program.
And we also have Andrew Idell from the B&M Historical Society online committee with us here tonight. And just a kind of a funny aside here, this is our second attempt at this interview. We had some technical difficulties last time, so it's going to go smoothly this time, we hope. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started here. So Jesse, you kind of grew up in this area of northeastern Massachusetts, in the area around Salem, Peabody, and Danvers, directly after the Boston, Maine kind of ceased to exist as an independent company. And as such, you have kind of an interesting insight into operations in this part of the state and the former B&M. As somebody that was growing up in this part of the state during that time, what were your observations of railroad activity, and how did you sort of become interested and involved in railroading as a kid?
Sure. So, I originally got a model train set when I was a little kid. I think I was probably 3 or 4 when I got an HO scale train set, and was, interested because outside my house were railroad tracks.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up on Pickering Street in Danvers. And if I don't live there anymore, but if anyone has Google Maps, they can look up 13 Pickering Street was my old house. And in the backyard of my house was the Danvers station.
Right.
And next to the house was the runaround for Danvers. And, I didn't really notice trains at that age until one day I saw what looked like a tractor pulling some tank cars up the line. And I guess at that time in the 80s and 90s, they had been experimenting with trackmobiles,
Right. Yep.
to bring about tank cars to save on costs or whatever reason they did. But as time went on, I started to become more and more cognizant of the trains. I had a lot of interest in my model railroad as a kid. My father had set up a piece of plywood for me, like every other kid, and I just ran the trains in circles. That was like really the first introduction to trains for me, was actually seeing a trackmobile, because I thought it was kind of weird that it could just drive off the rail.
Right.
Rather than doing a runaround in Danvers, they would just drive off the track and drive to the other side of the consist, rather than use the siding.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember as a young child, I was in first grade, and I would walk home from school with my mother, and usually at about that time of night, or that time in the afternoon, you would start to see the locomotive coming out to serve Eastern Propane. They would come up from what ultimately was Wakefield, through Linfield, West Peabody, and across Route 1 into Danvers.
Right.
In order to get to Eastern Propane by that time, because the Waters River Trestle was out of service, they would have to do a runaround and a shove move all the way through town, because Eastern Propane was a facing point switch. And my first cab ride was when I was in first grade. There was a thing at school where you could show your interests to other kids, and you're like a little table. And I brought my trains, and I brought a couple locomotives, and we lived right near the school. It was on the same street. So walking home, it was dark. I don't know what time it was, but it was dark. It was also winter, so it could have been 3 p.m.
Right.
We were walking home, and we saw the train again. I was all excited, and the conductor saw that I had model trains in my hand. And he got talking to me and said, well, asked my mother, is it okay if we put them in the engine? You can go meet us at the next crossing. So, I wasn't going to take no for an answer as a first grader.
Right.
And so I got my cab ride. My mother picked me up at the next crossing. I think they trundled along about 5 miles an hour
for sure.
at the time. But that was essentially the hook into it. And I remember as a kid, like, I would in the wintertime go out and shovel the switch at the runaround, because that was the one literally that was outside my bedroom window. And I'm sure they still put in for the hour of switch clearing time, but every snowstorm was out there with my plastic snow shovel, doing my best to keep the track clear for them. That was my duty, and I took pride in it. And there was an occasion one winter where either they outlawed or they had mechanical trouble, and the entire train was left up on the runaround. And having a locomotive outside my bedroom door, or outside my bedroom window, that I could just stare at all the time, and it was great. And that whole weekend, I took it as my solemn sworn duty to go protect that engine. And I would always walk down there and walk around it and make sure no one else went on it. And I'm like some, second grader saying, "Get off my train."
Right. Exactly.
But I always remember that the crew was very friendly. The conductor's name was Terry Marchino. He's since passed away, but he was a hell of a guy. During Christmas, they would actually drop off like a lantern or a hard hat or something, or a timetable that said Guilford. And as a little kid, I mean, you think that's the greatest thing in the world. And about we moved in 1996 to a different part of town, and I was still close to the tracks, a little bit towards the Pine Street area. And the last train I remember seeing in Danvers, at least that I saw, was in 1997.
Okay.
And I remember in 96, they come through and replaced a bunch of ties.
Oh, yeah.
And then in 97, that was the line was embargoed, and that was it for trains in Danvers.
Yeah, that's pretty common. They did the same thing up in Londonderry. They did a whole tie job down through Manchester Airport, and then like 2 years later they were done with it. So I think that was something probably just to satisfy the state commissions or something like that having to do with the properties. But it's neat that you mentioned some of the older guys that you noticed when you were a kid, because a lot of those guys I'm sure were B&M veterans originally.
Oh yeah, these guys were original, either B&M or Maine Central.
Yeah.
I don't know what the bidding was like
Mhm.
when they incorporated Springfield Terminal into the whole thing. I mean, that was way, way beyond my comprehension as
Sure.
a little kid.
Yeah.
But I remember there was Terry held down that job pretty regularly.
Mhm.
And the one night that he didn't hold down that job, I either he was on vacation or so they had a new crew out there.
Yeah.
And they weren't familiar with the territory because the conductor that was out there shoved 3 loaded propane cars onto the Waters River trestle and
That's
they
right.
derailed.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember hearing about it. Yeah.
And I know that if you haven't seen that trestle up close, it's about as shaky as a $3 bill.
Yeah.
And but it's a testament to how that trestle was built, because that trestle held up 3 loads and sustained the impact from a
And
derailment.
it's still standing.
And it's still standing today.
A couple, not too far from here, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've over the years when I got my first drone, I walked over there and flew around it, and I wouldn't walk across it myself, but I don't care about the robot. So
No.
I put it right up close, and wow, that's things in some rough condition now.
Yeah, it is. And it's funny that there's some pictures that are floating around of that. And I think those cars stayed on there for a little while.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. They it was in the middle of winter.
Mhm.
And for whatever reason, on the Peabody side, they removed the track and had a bunter.
Yes.
But on the Danvers side, they didn't. It was just open rail right onto the bridge.
Right.
And I think their remedy after that was they put a couple wheel stops
Okay.
just before
Yeah.
the bridge. But
Yeah, you'd think they put ties in the way or something, but
yeah, and it was like I said, that was the one time I know it wasn't Terry.
Mhm.
Honestly, I don't know if he was on vacation or sick or whatever, but it was some new conductor and he shoved it right
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah. That's the funny thing too, is that when you're a kid and all these things are happening around you and you're growing up in the railroad interest, I don't think you realize offhand the significance of the things that you're seeing until a long time after. And that's kind of the curse of growing up, is that when I was a kid, I remembered a lot of things that are gone now, and a lot of it was track that was still in place, or ties that were still in place, or something like that. But until recent years, I haven't put 2 and 2 together. I found a notebook the other day. My family had a paper company that was right next to the tracks in Manchester, and they the Nashville local used to go right by, and I remember I would write down what I would see, and I remember one day I wrote down GP9 goes by, and it turned out to be a GP40 high hood, but I didn't know any better as a kid. But that's the kind of thing that you don't really realize that's going on when you're a kid, and then you realize later, and you're like, oh, it's cool, I got to see this. So I think for you, growing up in this area, especially a former B&M branch line, it's kind of neat that you have those experiences. Now, when did you start to tie things together, that the importance of this being a B&M line, and when did you kind of come to that realization?
Well, when I first started becoming aware of what the B&M even was,
Mhm.
it was through this book here, called The Boston Maine, a photographic essay. And it was by Philip Ross Hastings, or featured his photographs. I don't know if he actually wrote it, but I got this book, I think as a Christmas present, or I got it somehow as a little kid, very little.
Yeah.
This is very old. And I started to make the connection that what I lived next to was the old Boston in Maine, and that there was a Boston in Maine outside of my side window in my
Right.
house.
Mhm.
And that book absolutely fascinated
Oh,
me,
yeah.
because I would just spend hours and hours and hours, just staring
Yep.
at the pictures in there, and what was,
Mhm.
and that's where actually I even became cognizant of what steam locomotives were.
Yeah.
Because I never grew up in the age of steam.
No.
And that always is a foreign concept to me, because my first train set was diesel, and I saw diesels outside my house, and when I looked at the pictures of those locomotives billowing smoke, and that to me was just amazing. And that book, I would just sit there for I said hours and hours at night, just looking through it. And that's when I first became cognizant there was a bigger world, number one, outside of my little environ as a kid, but that there was something called the Boston and Maine, and there was some history to it, because no one in my family was like a railroad person. I was the first person.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and it's great that you bring up sort of railroad media as being a formative touchstone for a kid. I followed kind of the same path you did. Growing up, my family had an interest in trains, mostly because my dad unloaded boxcars delivered by the B&M switcher at the family paper company, and my mom, the Conway branch ran right through her backyard, so the snow trains and all that would go right by. The RDC snow trains, of course, not the original ones, but yeah, they had an interest in it. But I think that, what really took it to another level for me was the books and the videos and all of this. And I know, Andrew, you kind of have a similar path as well. I know that you really got started with Robert Willoughby Jones's books, and that kind of formed the connection for you as well.
Yeah, definitely, Rick. Robert Willoughby Jones is first of his trilogy, Three Colorful Decades of New England Railroading. I got that when I was probably a little older, maybe like 15, 16 years old. But either way, like, it brought to life these locations that I had maybe heard about, but had obviously never gone to, being too young to have a driver's license at that time, places like Bellows Falls or Irving, Massachusetts, just all these random B&M locations that I'd heard about but never seen for myself. And Jesse, I can also relate to the Newburyport branch in that I grew up going to my grandmother's house up in Wakefield, Mass, and she lived not too far from the tracks. When I was younger, they were still periodically active, but I never got to see a train on those tracks. And all those years of going through the Wakefield area, just wondering, there was the active commuter rail line on the Western Main Line. Then you had this abandoned branch line going through town. I always yearned to see a train on those tracks. I never did. The final irony with that, though, is I live in Melrose now, so I'm oftentimes in Wakefield and Peabody, Reading area doing errands, etc. And they've been doing a massive track work project on the western route, so they're using the stub of the Newburyport right now as a staging area for all the track equipment. So finally now, after all these years, I see rail vehicles on this line that's sadly pretty much totally abandoned and in the process of becoming a rail trail.
Yeah. When the town here was trying to start the process of a rail trail, there was a kind of a push by a few of us to make it like up in Wolfeboro that we'll get into later, of a rail with trail. And that, unfortunately that idea didn't take very well. But that's neither here nor there. I think those contracts had been awarded before there was any public comment allowed. So, but that's not for here or there. That was unfortunately, at least the Eastern Division is gone. The Boston and Maine portion, or Salem and Lowell originally, is still intact up to Danvers Junction. I don't know what their future plans are, but the MBTA wouldn't relinquish that right away to a rail trail. The rail's actually still in.
I feel like every now and then I'll read or see something that shows potential future commuter rail, and Danvers always kind of seems to be on that sort of backlist. Now, whether that would ever happen, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not going to hold my breath on that, but yeah, it does seem to kind of come up here and there in like transit studies, etc. So it does seem to be on people's mind in some way, shape, or form.
I literally said to Rick outside, I said, it seems every 2 years when there's a congressional district, election, that transit study that they're going to put an electric trolley or an RDC or some sort of self-propelled vehicle between downtown Danvers and Salem Station seems to mysteriously arise until the election's over. And then you never hear about it again for another 2 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, believe me, it's the same story up in New Hampshire, as I know well. So, but it's interesting. It's funny, we all come from different backgrounds and different places and different pieces of the B&M, but we all kind of have this same feeling towards the B&M, and I've always felt this way about the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central and New England railroads, and it's probably true for wherever you're from and whatever your local railroad is. But there's such a common theme and feeling about the Boston and Maine that it's in some way a special railroad, and that it was a special railroad, and that you have people over in England and Germany that are members of the society that have the same interest in the B&M that may have never even set foot on B&M territory. So in your mind, what kind of makes the B&M special, and what about it has kept you interested, from childhood in this topic?
Well, Rick, that's an interesting question, because you and I both have the problem that the Egyptologist Zawi Hawass has, is he never was an Egyptian, but he has to interpret and write books about the history of the Egyptian Empire. You and I never grew up with the B&M. We were a little too late to the party.
Yeah.
So all we can do is look at pictures, books, memories, archives, current operations. For me, I mean, there's a little bit of hometown advantage, why people like the Red Sox and Patriots over any other team in the NFL or the MLB. But for me, what stuck with the B&M and why I became such a B&M fan was that book. Yeah. That captivated my imagination of these beautiful locomotives. We're going through beautiful small town places. I've never been a big city person,
right?
But I love that. We here in New England have a locomotive going through a covered bridge.
Yeah.
And I don't know about every place in the United States, but that's pretty unique to this part of the world. That they would go to the bother of a covered bridge.
Right.
Let alone several in this area.
Yeah.
And that's what always kind of captivated me was, staring at those images, that I was next to it. And I remember during like snowstorms, watching the switcher do its work outside my house as a little kid, being outside and watching the headlight pierce through the snow, sitting there on the snowbank, just looking at the glow of the number boards on that locomotive, on this big black locomotive. And you'd see that white G and that orange stripe and that number board lit, and you could smell the warm metal. And if you've smelt it before, you're smelling it right now. You're
smelling it now. And the cool thing too is I think that kind of keeps us all tied into it is that that 50 years before you were standing there, some little kid was standing there looking at a 60 switcher.
That's right.
Smelling the steam and the smoke versus the diesel fuel and all that. But yeah, it really is a fantastic railroad, and so many things about the B&M, attract so many different people. I mean, where else in the world are you going to find a railroad that had at one point in time the largest RDC fleet in the world, was still running steam commuter passenger trains with wooden coaches, and was running long distance passenger trains with E-units, running through covered bridges on the Conway branch, with.
And they had electrified mainline operations.
They had the Hoosier Tunnel, electric tunnel. Yeah, exactly.
I think if you were to categorize the B&M, I mean, you really got to split it up in at least 3 divisions.
For sure.
I mean, you had your rural branch lines, you had your heavy haul mainline freight that served the nitty gritty industrial areas of Lowell, Lawrence, Worcester.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Fitchburg area, I mean, you had that. They had, single car combines going through covered bridges.
Right. And then you have the commuter stuff in Boston.
And then you have in Boston with commuter trains and, passenger operations going up the Maine and out west. And, you go into the mountain railroading on the west end and you have electric locomotives through, a tunnel that rivals some of the stuff in the West, like
Sure.
Stevens Pass and
Yeah.
Stampede Pass.
Yeah.
That's what
And
makes it so interesting. It was one umbrella
Yeah,
for one company,
exactly.
and it was really, it said 3 or 4 different
It's really a
divisions.
bunch of companies,
Yeah.
right? And that has to do, of course, with all the mergers, swallowing up all the stuff in the 1800s. But yeah, no, it was. And Andrew, you ever thought about that?
yeah, what I was going to say, what's especially cool about the uniqueness of New England too, geographically, is that a rail fan back in the prime of the B&M, theoretically, they could rail fan like the industrial lines of Lawrence, then they could rail fan the busy Fitchburg Main Line, then they could drive right up to Peterborough, New Hampshire, rail fan, Mogul Country. It was
Yeah.
really, it was really just rail fans' delight in a lot of ways back in the prime of its system, or the height of the system, I should say.
I think that's why you see so many of these well-known photographers, that visited the B&M, that weren't necessarily, from B&M territory. Now, see Jim Shaughnessy was from Troy, which was B&M territory, but, that's way, way out there on the West End. But I mean, he came and shot the B&M and all kinds of people came and shot it and maybe only visited for, once in their lifetime. But like you said, they came, and covered so much in one go. And unfortunately, we don't have the privilege of doing that now because we missed out on a lot of that. But that's what's so great about all these photos and books and all this stuff is you can rediscover it, and you're never going to be looking for mysteries to solve. And it's such a great thing to cover. And I know you also have, obviously, looking around here, an interest in the Maine Central as well,
Yeah.
which follows a similar spirit. I mean, you have a railroad that's a 44 tonner and two hoppers going to a cannery in Eastport. And on the other side of the system, you have a mountain railroad, the mountain division that rivals, some of the stuff in the West or the Alleghenies. And it's a very unique railroad. Now, how did you come to be interested in the Maine Central?
Well, as a kid, my cousins lived up in Maine. Originally, they lived in Burlington, which there's nothing around there.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had moved to Belfast, and they lived right up the hill from the Belfast yard.
Yep.
If you've ever been to Belfast, the entire town is one hill.
Yeah.
And the yard was right at the bottom of that by the river. And, as a little kid, we would go up to Belfast. And of course, there's something wrong in my brain because I'm instantly magnetated towards trains.
Right.
So I was always wandering around down in Belfast, getting kicked out of the yard, and I'd be climbing in that Berlin Mills engine they used for parts. It was stuffed and mounted out in the back.
Yep.
And I was always getting kicked out of there as a kid. Now I yell at people for trespassing, but I did the same thing. So believe me, I'm no one to talk. But the Maine Central proper, I had heard of it, but I had never had much connection other than my trips to Maine until I got into motor cars, the rail cars. And, I did a trip on the mountain division with the rail car, and you're instantly addicted. I mean, what's not to love about it? It's mountain railroading. And, then I got, the Maine Central and color books.
Right.
And
You're addicted.
yeah. And, like I said, it's the same problem with Maine Central is that was long gone before I came around.
Yeah.
And, I remember I was thinking like, wow, this was the best they could do back then. Like they couldn't, why didn't they just route it through the B&M?
Right.
Why build a whole, Guilford eventually made that decision anyway.
Yeah.
But, I guess they only do 2 independent companies.
Right.
But, But I remember just riding up that line and going, the amount of labor and workmanship that was done to make that mountain railroad possible. And, this was, guys with shovels. This wasn't excavators and loaders, and this was horses and shovels. And, you look at the craftsmanship they put into a culvert, just a simple culvert. Just the chiseled granite and everything fits
Dry laid. Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's just so fits so tight. And that was one of the ways I got really hooked on the Maine Central. And I loved the Harvest Gold paint scheme.
Yeah.
There's something about that paint scheme that I love. I don't know why. I don't know. It's just it's a very fascinating railroad, and it ran through so much diverse area. Obviously a lot of rural areas. But you had the mountains of New Hampshire and then in the Vermont, we're in interchange with the CP. And that was just that line always fascinated the Mountain Division proper. Yeah, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say I don't know much of the geography of Maine in detail as I do New Hampshire, Massachusetts,
Right.
and so on. Beyond, I've ridden a lot of lines in Maine in my rail car, but I'm riding in the modern day
Yeah.
where it was MMA and CMQ. I was never around for the Bangor or Rustic
Mhm.
or the Maine Central.
Yeah.
And a lot of that stuff has been merged and moved and stuff. So, and one thing we were saying about the B&M gobbling up corporations, we talked about last time is I'm shocked that in the 1950s, when the Boston and Maine owned the Maine Central, that they didn't make a Guilford of the time. They relinquished control of it.
Yeah, and one thing we did talk about a little bit is that there was some talk about that between later on in the 70s between Spencer Miller of the Maine Central, Alan Dustin of the B&M, and Buck Dumaine, who was at the Bangor and Aroostook, and they were talking about doing some sort of New England merger at the very least, pooling power and stuff like that. And it never did happen. I guess you could technically say Guilford was that, even though the Bangor and Aroostook wasn't included. But they were talking about it in the 70s, and there was some talk about including the B&M in the Norfolk and Western and all of that. So I think what ended up happening was a lot of companies and forces outside of New England was looking at what was happening in New England with manufacturing and all that, and was kind of hesitant to touch a sick railroad like the B&M, at least in the early 70s. So unfortunately, you didn't see that happen earlier. But if you had seen that happen earlier, I mean, maybe something like that would have strengthened the system. You can't really say for sure in hindsight.
Yeah, I mean, we'll never know. I mean, I always wondered why. I mean, they had a joint railroad, the Portland terminal.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Obviously, I wasn't alive and I didn't work there. But just you see conglomerates now that just swallowed up. And I always thought it was just such a waste when you get to the end of your track, swapping your locomotives out,
right?
Especially the diesel era, where they're all the same. Essentially, it's all a pinned connector.
Yeah.
Swapping out your power, but for another set of locomotives. But that was the style of the time.
Yeah, and it may have had something to do with the way labor laws were back then. I don't know if there was something having to do with the unions and the power and the ownership. I know a lot of the B&M stuff was not owned by the B&M. I know a lot of it was owned by the bank. So maybe they had some problem with Maine Central using B&M power that the B&M didn't own or something like that. But yeah, that is interesting. And New England is kind of unique in that sense, where for a long time there was no major merger culture when it came to the railroads. When I think about the B&M and the Maine Central and all that. So,
well, I think one of the problems the B&M had back then, and obviously it's proved true, is, you look at the simple North Country around Wakefield, Groveton, Berlin, Gorham. I mean, that is a mind-boggling maze because it's not today. What you see is not what was.
No.
And I've tried to look at maps, and we're going to do a motorcar excursion on the remaining part of the Berlin branch, and just trying to wrap my head around, okay, where did this actually go?
Yeah.
We rode the Stewartstown branch, the last remaining portion of that before it was ripped up.
Oh, yeah.
With the motor cars. It was
Falls,
it was like 6 miles, and it was beautiful country up there. But yeah, that's the problem the B&M had, is they had a lot of duplicate lines that went eventually to the same place. Right. And consolidation and cost. At the time they were built, they were probably profitable, but I never felt bad about rail trails on stuff that wasn't profitable in the 30s.
Yeah. Oh, right.
They weren't making money on that when railroads were the only thing around, and they were consolidating lines. So if someone makes a rail trail on that, it's not that that doesn't really get my cackles up too much.
Yeah, like Jesse, I'll just chime in for a second on that. Like, I admit in many ways I do enjoy the rail trails, and that they allow me to access areas that if it was, just an abandoned right of way or maybe reverted to adjacent landowners, you wouldn't get access to. And, let's be honest. I mean, towns like New Boston, New Hampshire, I mean, Bristol, I don't think Bristol, New Hampshire is going to be looking for a freight service from Pan Am or CSX anytime in the near future, you know?
Right.
So I mean, recently the town of Bristol, like they've been unearthing their old turntable site down by the river, I believe. They're going to put like a park, a trail down there. And I mean, I'd much rather see it go to that purpose for the public to enjoy than for all that to just be lost in the woods, never to be seen again. So,
Yeah.
you know, obviously, first and foremost, I'm a train guy, but you know, at the end of the day, a lot of these lines, to your point, Jesse, they're just not coming back, and they never will. So why don't we do what we can to preserve what's left there, so people like us can at least take a walk and be like, oh, look, there's a culvert there. There's you know, maybe there's a milepost somewhere, you know, just get it so it can be enjoyed from sort of an archaeological perspective.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. I mean, even stuff that, you know, the B&M parted with in the 70s, you know, like the Goffstown branch, it's a 7-mile branch. They were doing 1-2 cars at a time. I mean, you know, that's never going to have a practical use, but yeah, it's interesting too with, you know, all these lines that, you know, there's so much that that you have an opportunity to explore and to learn about. And one thing that all three of us have a common interest in are logging railroads, specifically up in the White Mountains. And that's a whole nother world where you could spend your entire life just researching that. And where did these logging lines go? When were they used? What kind of power did they use? When were they done away with? And that's something that you and I have discussed, and I know Andrew and I have discussed, and we talked about a little bit last time. But why do logging railroads interest you specifically, and where did you kind of get into that whole interest?
Well, they interest me because, I mean, those were the log trucks of the day. And those guys would work so hard to build a track up the side of a mountain to use it for 6 months and then rip it up and go somewhere else. I mean, that was the only way to get the stuff out. But just the country they were in, the type of territory.
Yeah.
What really fascinates me is that, you know, without looking too hard, you can stumble across switch stands in the middle of what seems to be nowhere today.
Yeah.
You know, that really just fascinates me. You can be walking out in the side of a mountain, and there's a piece of 60-pound rail just sitting out there.
Yep.
And you think of the manpower and stuff to build that. That's what initially fascinates me. But also the types of locomotives. And that was my first introduction was Clark's Trading Post. You know, as much as, you know, we like to make fun of the bear show and everything. And feeding your relatives to the bears. You know, thank God that the Clark brothers had the forethought to save that.
Yeah.
You know, and I've said to you before, I mean, you know, looking at satellite pictures, I said, there's something beyond Hobo Junction.
Yeah.
The satellite is just, the pictures are too straight. There's no straight lines in nature. And, you know, we ended up being the Johnson branch there, but, you know, walking around Clark's, I was a little bit ignorant the first time I had been there as to the history of those engines. And when I started digging, I thought those were brought in from somewhere else initially. I didn't ever go there as a kid. I went there when I first started dating my wife, way back when. But I didn't realize those were hometown heroes.
Oh yeah.
You know, in fact, the Shea number 5 was actually, along with the other number 5, were ICC commissioned to actually run on the main line of the B&M.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting fact. You see a Shea in mainline service.
Right. From, you know, as far as Livermore Falls back up to Woodstock and all that. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, there was a Shea in mainline service here in New Hampshire. And, you know, I think it was very fascinating and amazing that Clark's took because, you know, they could easily dieselize, and the average tourist would never know the difference.
Right.
And, you know, I'm a little bit saddened in the last couple of years, they haven't run steam a lot, if at all. And they haven't done the steam days, because that's just an absolute fascinating day.
Oh yeah.
And I would, you know, I've been to that steam days fest before, and what a great day up there. But that's where I really became cognizant that these engines still exist. And these weren't from some far west logging camp.
Right, yeah.
They were running down the street.
Yeah, and you look at the climax of the Shay, and yeah, the atmosphere of Clark's trading post kind of at first glance, you're right. It doesn't seem like it's but then you realize you're standing next to a Shay that 100 years ago was used in these woods by these logging guys, rough and tumble logging guys, back when that part of New Hampshire was basically a frontier.
It was. I mean,
Wild West town. I mean, you think about the way the White Mountains used to be. I mean,
you look at the Bill Gove books,
yeah,
and I mean, it was no different than Washington or Oregon.
Yep.
The spruce was an attractive commodity for them.
Yeah.
The spruce from that part of New Hampshire was very well renowned for its ability. It was actually used in a lot of aircraft in World War One.
So that's right. Yep.
And they those guys were hard-working men, and you wouldn't find that kind of character almost anywhere today.
No.
And that was tough work. I mean, those guys got up at the crack of dawn and they worked a long time. But what I'm very happy with Clark's Trading Post is, to me, it's the Edaville of logging railroads.
Yep.
It saved these locomotives from scrap. Same as Edaville did to the Maine two-footers.
Yep.
So that someday a future generation can look at that.
Yeah.
I can go see the BB River number 5.
Right.
I can go see the Climax number 6.
Yeah.
And, I really hope, kind of coming out of the COVID world and people pulling away their security blankets a little bit, that they will start running steam and tourism will come back to its levels that it used to be.
Yeah.
And that, we can have those steam locomotives stay in an operational condition. I understand, like any business, they have to make money, and steam is an incredibly expensive
it can be
outfit. And I'm no fool when it comes to that type of stuff.
right.
These are businesses; they do have to make money. So the railroader in me understands that. The rail fan in me goes, I wish that was a steam engine right now.
Another paradox that you've experienced too.
Point circling back to the logging railroads, I think when I started, especially looking at Bill Gove's books a few years back, you look at these maps of like just the web of track that expanded outwards from Lincoln kind of being the quote unquote hub of these logging railroads, and it just went so deep into this like uninhabited wilderness back. I mean, even to today, I mean, the wilderness that these railroads ran into, like you wouldn't want to get lost there without a map, a compass, GPS. I mean, this is very, very wild country, even to this day. And these logging railroads, they just, built them every like nook and cranny of this wilderness. And it's pretty, and to Jesse's point, like with pretty primitive tools, horses, wagons, picks, shovels. I mean, it's pretty fascinating what was accomplished there so long ago. And nowadays is, many people hiking in probably are aware of what it was, but I'm guessing just as many of the hikers you see going into the woods there have no idea of what was once running through those woods down those trails.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you can't blame them, because I mean, when you think about the White Mountains, the thing about the logging railroads that always appealed to me was just the mystery of it. I mean, you got these deep, dark woods, you don't know what's in there. Places like Livermore, the Village, and all this, and it's like, it's just so interesting to me is that the average person going to Lincoln for the weekend or whatever, or skiing at any of those ski places, they don't know what used to be in those woods and what still is in those woods, and that's just so interesting to me. And kind of going off of your piece there about hiking and hikers, I know the long trail over in Vermont, a lot of that is built on former logging railroads in the Manchester, Vermont area. And that's a similar thing too, is that you're right, a lot of these right-of-ways survive now as hiking trails. You think about like the Zealand Falls Railroad, or the Zealand Valley Railroad up way up north in New Hampshire. A lot of that's a popular hiking trail now, but I mean, where you're hiking, Climaxes used to run,
Yeah, those at least me, I always ask why.
Yeah.
Why is this here? You drive down a street in town and go, why is this Depot Road? Where was the train station?
Yep.
And I would drive through Lincoln. When I never really had much exposure to Lincoln, other than when I first started doing the hobo track car run.
Yep.
That we used to do up in Lincoln. And I would kind of drive around the area and I would see the EBNL locomotive outside Loon
No, sure.
and go, why? Why
Right.
is this here? I wasn't really aware of what was the extent of the EBNL. And back then, some of the mills, when I first started doing that run, were somewhat there.
Yeah.
Some of the remains were there. Most of that had been gone and starting to be developed to the resort that's there today. But I mean, when you go into the plaza where Gordy's Fish and Steak is,
Mhm.
why is that little Plymouth switcher there?
Yeah.
Ask yourself why. Why is it? What's the story behind this? And that's what always fascinated me is there's so many relics of that still around.
Mhm.
You coming up the Kangamangas, you can see the grade.
Yeah. Yeah.
There. And if you got a sharp eye, you can see we're up to the turnaround right by the hairpin turn. It's Hancock Trailhead.
Yep.
You can still see some of that gradient there. And I mean, nature's obviously taking over
Yeah.
year by year, but it's a fascinating part of, New Hampshire history. But I mean, that was the rough and tumble frontier.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that was people coming over, seeking the promise of the United States.
Yep.
So many agents would go to Boston and New York to draft these men right off the boat.
Oh, yeah.
And they didn't need to speak English because they didn't need to talk to anybody.
Right. If they're from Norway or something like that, it's a plus,
Yeah, and that also kind of speaks to me is that the promise of America
Yeah.
was there because these people came over from whatever they were in this hard life logging was better than what they had.
Yeah, that's true. Yep. And railroading and logging railroading. And you see that, I mean, no matter what railroad company or operation you're looking at, the B&M was certainly not exempt from that. You had certain guys that spoke, French Canadian and spoke French, on the job. And if you were if you were from Boston and somehow you hired on to, a job somewhere up north, you didn't fit in,
Yeah.
And it's interesting.
And one thing about going back to the logging railroads
Yeah.
is, we think today, we in the present are so disconnected from the past,
Right.
but not that long ago,
No.
this existed.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to think we're a relatively young country.
Yeah.
But we think back to the 1800s is so far away, the 1900s is so far away. But when you look at it, Thomas Jefferson, Harriet Tubman, and Ronald Reagan all could have met each other.
Yeah.
We're not that far from
No.
the past.
No, we're not.
And that's why I think places like Clark's that preserve this, it's for the future.
Yeah.
Are such great things.
One thing that I didn't realize that I found fascinating is that the East Branch in Lincoln actually wasn't fully abandoned until 1960, I think.
Yeah.
And that astounded me. I was like,
Right.
how could something, an operation of this size, this magnitude, be abandoned? Not I mean, like within our parents' lifetime.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
there's really not a whole lot of traces of it left. And it was just that was just sort of a fact that blew my mind. I was like, wow, there were main lines on the B&M that were abandoned before the East Branch in Lincoln was fully abandoned. Just to give it a little
Right, the
give it a
White
little
Mountains division.
yeah, the White Mountains division was gone. Part of the Eastern was gone to
Yeah.
Portland. I mean, it's pretty astounding when you think of it in that perspective.
And they were still using the number 5 right up until the early 60s, maybe into the 60s.
Yeah, I think there might be Bill Gove, his the big book he did on the Lincoln Woods. I think there might be like a photo from towards the very end of that locomotive. I'll have to look for it, but yeah. It's pretty.
I know when
fascinating.
they did an excursion up to Lincoln in '64 with RDCs, Bud cars, and they brought out that steam engine and ran it, back and forth. And I don't know if it was still on the roster for the East Branch Lincoln at that point, or if the Clarks had acquired it and just hadn't moved it yet. But it was still in Lincoln in the mill yard, in operational status in '64.
Yeah.
So that's and my parents were born in '62. And so you're really not that far disconnected.
You're never
from
that
it.
far away.
You're not.
Yeah.
You go talk to somebody, like Dane Malcolm and shake his hand and know that he met guys that were railroading in like 1910, 1900. You know, it's crazy the way these things work, but it's always good to keep it in perspective for sure. Now, another topic that we're all kind of interested in, and you have a very invested interest in, is the Wolfeboro Railroad. And the Wolfeboro is something that is kind of a common fabric around here, especially around people that are interested in the Boston and Maine, because so many people have a connection to the Wolfeboro Railroad, whether it's having been there and experienced it, having started railroading, working for the Wolfeboro, or having, kind of discovered the Boston and Maine through the modern day iteration of the Wolfeboro Railroad, which is the Cotton Valley Rail Trail, through the motorcar group and that sort of thing. So, with the Wolfeboro Railroad being kind of a common thread for so many people, how did you become invested in it?
So kind of the same thing, Rick, with the B&M is day late, dollar short on when I was born.
Yeah.
The Wolfeboro folded up in 86 and I was born in 84. So we had no connection to Wolfeboro until 1987 when my grandparents bought a little lakeside cottage there on Route 109. Going there as a little kid, we would go past Fernald Station, we'd go past the engine house. I remember the crossing lights still being there at Route 28, right by where the Wright Museum is now. Never really, I always looked down the tracks in hopes of seeing a train that was never going to come.
Yeah.
I remember there's a little restaurant there, Katie's Kitchen, down in the Wolfeboro Plaza, which actually is on an old bay that was filled in. And they'd have like pictures of the trains. And I always thought that was fascinating, the little drawings of the trains. And there was but as far as like the Wolfeboro proper, never really had much of a personal connection at the time.
Yeah.
There was a amazing railroad attraction in Wolfeboro called the Clickety Clack Model Railroad. It was a hobby store out front, but in the back they had just an absolutely amazing train layout. And I think that was really kind of another fascinating thing for me, was like that was like our vacation spot. We'd always go to the Clickety Clack. And I know my parents, again, they weren't trained people, but they probably get frustrated with me. But I could spend all day watching the layout out back there. And time went on. Again, nothing really I saw with Wolfeboro. I didn't even know there was a Wolfeboro Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
I had heard from one of my relatives that had a camp up there before that, there used to be a little train and that's long gone, blah, blah, blah. So, I never really had that connection to it. I had heard of a little operation that was gone. We come into more later times. I was just going into high school and we were visiting my grandmother up at her cottage for the weekend. And behind her cottage, it's what's now called Ellies Woodland Walk. It's a little path.
Yep.
This was really pre-trail days. I'd followed that path up the line or up through the woods one day, and it was kind of a rainy, crappy day, and I got lost.
Yeah.
I think I would eventually find my way back anyway, but the trail wasn't as tamped down and as marked as it is today. But, when I realized I was lost, I was about 50 feet from the railroad tracks.
Yep.
And I said, well, I know where the railroad tracks are. And looking at the sun, the sun through the clouds, I was able to determine which way was east and west. So I said, well, if I walk west, I'll eventually hit Route 109. I know where I'm going to come out.
Yep.
And as I'm walking down the track, I hit,
Mm-hmm.
what the heck is that sound? This track's abandoned.
Yeah.
And I hear a little toot of a horn. I turn around, and there are these little yellow and orange boxes with headlights coming at me.
Yeah.
And I was bewildered.
You're right.
I was like, what the heck is this thing?
Yeah.
And I just remember that sounded, probably 4 or 5 of them went by, and they're going the other direction that I was. It took me about 5 minutes to pick my jaw up off the track.
Right.
I was just amazed. I said, oh my God, what is that? What are those things? And I was diehard rail fan. I didn't even know those things existed.
Right.
So I walked back, got to Route 109, walked back to the camp. And I said to my mother, I said, hey, I want to go down to that train store. So I couldn't drive at the time. I was way too young. So I went to the train store and I asked the guy, I said, hey, I saw a bunch of these things. What are they? And he said to me, those are called speeders or track cars and motor cars, whatever verbiage you want to use. Yeah. Generally, they're called speeders. And he's telling me about there's an organization that runs out of that engine house down there. And I said, oh, okay. And, he's like, oh, I'd like to go see. He's like, oh, they only meet once a month. And, so I said, oh, that must have been their meeting today. So I missed it. And I said, what would one of those cost? He's like, oh, I have one for, this amount of money. And, to a teenager, you might as well have said $1 million.
Right. Yeah.
that amount of money didn't exist in my realm. And, I had just started working at a model train store at the Peabody Mall. It was like called the Great Train Store. It was a part of a chain. But, I started working there in high school and I was saving a little bit of money. But, when the guy gave me the price, I said, well, might as well buy a 737 too. Right. And, I had forgotten about it. And, over the winter, it started, nagging at me. And so I saved up my money and I went up there later the next year. And I said to the guy, I said, you still selling one of those cars? And he says, yep. I said, all right, well, he gave me some contact numbers because I guess the owner of that clickety clack was one of the tried to start Cotton Valley, but at some point prior to my existence in the club had a falling out with somebody.
Okay, yep.
I don't know the details of it, but he wasn't a member anymore. And what was the modern Cotton Valley. But, he says, oh, I'll sell you one of these cars. So I picked the cheaper of the two he had for sale because I didn't have a lot of money. And I looked at it. And then I said, well, I don't have a driver's license. Yeah. My family doesn't own a trailer. About 90 miles from my house. These are the logistics a 15-year-old doesn't think of.
Yeah, exactly. The wisdom you have not acquired.
Yeah. Basically for someone that knew everything back then, I didn't know anything.
Right.
And I was like, Jesus, how am I going to get this thing home? So one of the numbers I had for the Cotton Valley group was a guy named Rick. And, I contacted Rick and I said, blah, blah, blah. I want to buy this car. The guy agreed to sell it to me. I haven't paid him yet. I haven't seen the car for a few minutes. And he's like, well, there's a guy in Danvers in your town that's a member. And I said, geez, that's lucky.
Yeah.
So I got a hold of him, made an arrangement. His name was Dwight Winkley, heck of a guy, very knowledgeable, Danvers guy, grew up with the B&M, was in the motor cars, pretty heavy at the time, and also live steam. And so I contacted Dwight via phone, and he said, "Yep, November meeting, I'll be there. I'll tow it home for you." I said, "Okay." So I had it all arranged. We went there. We looked at the car. The guy could have probably told me the car was on fire. I still would have bought it.
Yeah. Right.
And with the condition it was, it probably would have been better off being on fire. Because, it was, I didn't have a lot of money, again, as a teenager. So that car weighs about 1,500 pounds.
Right.
They're heavy. And so I paid him the money. It was November. The ground was frozen. And his property was right up against the tracks by the Mass Landing crossing. If you're familiar with the Wolfeboro line, I pushed that car across his lawn. Mm-hmm. We built a little temporary bridge of timber to get it onto the track. A 15-year-old's back can do amazing things, right. Especially when you're powered by motivation and stupidity. Yeah. And I push the car across that little temporary bridge, get it up onto the track. I push it down to the Mass Landing crossing, Dwight comes down with his trailer, winches it on for me, bring it back to Fernald, to the Cotton Valley meeting. And I'm a new member. I got, I don't know anybody.
Yeah.
And I open up the hood on it. And of course, that's like the moss to the flame. Everybody starts coming over looking at it. And of course, the car didn't run. And people are like, oh, you got to fix this. You got to fix this.
Yeah.
So that was my first reality check. Brought it home. It was a rainy, crappy night down here, and they set it up. I remember just sitting in the car.
Yeah.
In my driveway, just sitting on the pavement. Sitting in the car, just staring at it, smelling it. Just enjoying the experience. I didn't have a driver's license, but I owned a piece of railroad equipment.
Rolling stock, right?
Yeah. I guess
The
that's where my priorities are, I guess.
Yeah.
So, So I got involved with Cotton Valley. I would attend the meetings. And that's why I kind of became more aware of what the Wolfeboro was and when it was and who. Actually, there's some members of the Cotton Valley group that worked for the Wolfeboro.
Yeah.
And I really got a sense of like, wow, this was an amazing little operation. And then I got more into the history of the Wolfeboro. And I think the Wolfeboro is such a common thread with people is you only need to look at that postcard of the 250 going across a snowy causeway with the snow plow and caboose to say, if there is nothing else that is New England railroading, it's this.
That's it.
This is it.
Yep.
What an amazing operation they had
yeah.
back then. And, I wasn't around, but if I could say there's anything closer to paradise, it would have been that.
Mm-hmm.
A small branch line with a steam locomotive. And, like Brian said, that is a well-proportioned engine for that line. I've seen the 250 since, at Edaville and when it was stored in Concord on New England Southern, right by the turntable pit. And I poked around a little bit, and I they went out of business for a reason.
Yeah.
Times were different back then. They had competition, and it is what it is. But man, I wish they were still around today. I wish they were, and I'm glad they're not, because we wouldn't have what we have today with Cotton Valley.
Right.
And that kind of brings me into the Cotton Valley stuff. Is people think the Wolfeboro's dead and gone.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's most of the track is still in. The only portion of track that's gone is from Route 28 in downtown Wolfeboro to the depot.
Yep.
The rest of the line is still intact and used by rail vehicles.
Yeah.
So people tend to think that it's gone. It's 1986 it disappeared into the fabric of time, and it's not. I mean, it's used all the time.
Right.
So Cotton Valley was formed in 1992 by a group of people that were interested in, one, running motor cars, but two, preserving that corridor.
Yep.
And over time, there was an interest by the locals to build a trail. And obviously it's a beautiful piece of scenery. But I think they took the most common sense approach is, it was a grassroots effort. They didn't have the RTP grants and federal funding that they have today. It was the Cotton Valley members helping build that trail.
Yeah.
And it was through partnerships and good faith that worked and still continues to work today.
Right.
We work very closely with the snowmobile groups, with the walking groups to preserve that corridor for all three of us to use.
Yep.
And we live in harmony. And I think that should really be a model when rail trails are considered.
Mm-hmm.
And I recently did a interview with the union leader about that issue that they're having over in Concord is, you have one group that wants hard this side and another group that wants hard this side. And, we got to meet in the middle, but most railroad right of ways are 60 feet wide in most cases.
Yeah.
The tracks are 4 or 6 feet wide.
Right.
What's the other, 50 feet doing?
50 feet, right.
How wide is your trail going to be?
Yeah.
But, I also see, Wolfeboro, it's pretty well used by people. But I think, they're coming at it with all three groups working together.
Yeah.
We have our track that we can use. And we are the only place in the United States, to my knowledge, that you can belong to an organization and just use track at your discretion after you've been mentored and gone through our safety program. But you can use track when you want.
Yeah.
And that's an amazing thing that we have. We also maintain and run on the what's technically the Conway branch. We call it the Ossipee line. It's about a 7-mile stretch over in Ossipee from Mountain View Station up to Route 16 and down to Route 28 Bridge, where the North Coast property starts.
Yep.
I mean, again, we maintain it. We work with the snowmobilers. We do all the maintenance out there. I mean, I've been vice president of the club for a couple of years now, 4 years, 3-4 years now, at least. And before that, I was a director.
Yeah.
I was approached by some of the older members and say, you're really young and showing interest. We'd like you to step forward. And I did that. But I will say they are a fantastic group of people. And some organizations, you always have some internal politics. And I'm very thankful to say that Cotton Valley doesn't have that.
Yeah.
And we continue to remain free of that.
Mhm.
And that's a great thing, because I mean, our club president, Bruce Stewart, worked for the Wolfeboro. And I'll tell you, he is a tenacious leader. We kind of joke around, they call him Ricochet Rabbit, because he's always going in like 82 different directions. But I tell you what, if you were in the organization, you'd want him on your side, because, we were able to get legislation passed that finally recognized motor cars as an official OHRV in New Hampshire.
Yep.
So that we now have the same legal footing at the table, so to speak, as snowmobiles and ATVs. And that was a big accomplishment for us. The fact that, we were able to get the trail done and, have it so that motor cars can use it and we can use it safely with pedestrians. The fact that, we do excursions and we have partnerships with local short lines. Is another amazing thing that I don't think you see in tons of places. I mean, there's a few Friends of the Railroad type organizations, but to the extent and professionalism that we offer a short line that seeks our assistance, and there's some operations in New Hampshire that have taken part of it, and some in Maine too.
Mm-hmm.
We can come out, in tourist railroads and short lines, very short lines, and museums. It's probably insult to them. They can't survive without volunteers.
Right.
If a trolley museum up at Seashore was able to had to pay every single person to do that job, they wouldn't survive.
Yeah.
So we go up and we offer our assistance, and it's a great relationship that we forge with local short lines, and I hope it continues, and I think it will. I think it's a great thing to have. We put in some sweat equity, cutting brush, and doing some of the minor stuff that doesn't really make sense to pay someone to go do. Make their property look great, and we get to ride our motor cars.
Right, that's true. Yeah, and I think a great thing about the Cotton Valley Group is just the opportunities that it provides, for its members, but also, people that, go for a ride along or something to experience various parts of railroading here in New Hampshire and in New England. You think about the rides that you guys do out on the Hillsborough branch, on the Milford Bennington, which is really the only chance anybody can have now to experience that part of the Boston and Maine from a rail vehicle. And there's a great video that we were able to do a few years ago with Cotton Valley, where we rode out to Bennington, from Wilton to Bennington and back. And there's a video on our YouTube channel of that. But that's an exclusive opportunity that you can't get anywhere else. And Cotton Valley, providing that service to the short lines, but also providing that historical service to witness these things from a rail vehicle is just one of a kind.
Excuse me. One of the privileges I've had is with the motorcar groups being able to ride some track that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
One of the lines I comes to mind is the Calais branch.
Mm-hmm.
We did a trip up there, and we rode that all the way out to Calais.
Yeah.
From Machias, through the Moosehorn Wildlife Refuge, saw where the Ayers Junction is, where the Eastport branch went off. And I got to say, that was an absolutely amazing ride. And why it was ripped up, I don't know.
Yeah.
I didn't see a technical reason why in most places the trail that is not used very much, to my understanding, couldn't be 6 feet off to the side.
Right.
I expect anyone to build a new bridge, but the chance a rail car could ever be out there at the same time he's stopping let the pedestrians go.
Yeah.
So, that was kind of a sad thing to see that bill, but I was happy to be able to ride it.
Yep.
And I think, with rail cars, with the national organization, I mean, we do some amazing runs that people wouldn't normally see unless you decided to go work for the railroad.
Yep.
We've done the excursion from White River Junction up to Newport, Vermont on the Pompey sub. And you would never see that unless you either had a time machine or an engineer's ticket and work for the railroad. Same with the White Mountain branch,
right?
From Concord to Lincoln on the Snowflake excursion. That is something you wouldn't see ordinarily. I mean, you see bits of it on the Hobo and Winnipesaukee.
Yeah, exactly.
But you don't see the entire contiguous branch. I mean, there's so much amazing scenery.
Oh yeah.
Especially going through Livermore and just
North of Plymouth. Yep.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah.
That concludes this week's episode of High Green and the first part of our interview with Jessie Mazzie. Be sure to come back next week for part 2, where we talk about Jessie's career working for railroads on former Boston and Maine trackage, and a broad discussion about the purpose of the railroad interest and what it can offer fans growing up in the post-Boston and Maine world. Thanks again for listening as always, and we're looking forward to having you back for another episode of High Green.